Good evening. Tonight I start with a quote. Telecom was the golden goose which laid the golden egg. The Supreme Court ensured that the golden goose will not lay the golden egg again for a very little while. Unquote. That was Communications and IT Minister Kapil Sibal addressing the National Conclave of the CII earlier today. Taking on the Apex Court's various decisions, Sibal said that the intervention of the country's Apex Court had led to a massive degrowth of the telecom sector. In a landmark judgment on February the 2nd last year, the Supreme Court annulled 122 mobile permits of 9 telecom companies and ordered the government to auction airwaves vacated by the telcos at market-determined prices. In 2012, the combined auctions of 3G and broadband spectrum fetched the government more than 100,000 crore. The decision to auction 2G spectrum did not result in a windfall for the government and instead saw some players exiting the market. In his comments to India Inc., Telecom Minister argued that the intervention of the courts in policy making created dire trouble as the courts did not have the experience to deal with matters of economic policy. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight on The Big Picture, I put the question to an eminent panel whether intervention or interference, whatever you might want to call it, by the courts in the telecom sector has led to the so-called sunrise sector to go into its shell. And if there has been a deceleration of growth indeed, is it a permanent degrowth? Can it be reversed? Is judicial activism in economic policy and policy decisions an unhealthy trend like the minister seems to suggest? All these questions and more on tonight's debate. Mighty pleased to have Soli Sorabjee on the panel. The man needs no introduction, eminent legal expert. Syngal also joins us as well, former CMD BSNL. Ravi Prasad is a telecom analyst, has joined me in the studio. And Rajan Mathew, Director General of the Cellular Operators Association, will also join us on the show. I welcome you all on the show tonight. I would like to start with Rajan Mathew, if I could. First up, the analogy. Your thoughts on the analogy, Rajan? It's not really simple. It's not really that simple, so to say. The courts did what they did because malpractices, at least the accusation of malpractices in the process of making economic policy and the implementation of economic policy were rife. What do you think of the minister's comments?
We really don't have any major issue with the court's decision. We have all along propounded that auction is the way forward, so the Supreme Court did indicate that that was the case going forward. The Supreme Court, in our opinion, made a very clear decision in terms of the cancellation of the licenses. The impact of that perhaps may have been pretty draconian in terms of impacting people that perhaps were inadvertently pulled into this. But overall, the issue was rather clear in terms of putting that spectrum back on auction. We believe that unnecessarily this whole decision was muddied by contaminating it by, refarming 900 megahertz spectrum and one-time spectrum fees, and then the whole process of fixing the reserve price at these unattainable amounts was contributory factors which spiraled the whole industry to where it is today, and certainly both goose and egg are invisible at this point.
Right. Soli Sorabjee, let me come to you now. From a legal standpoint, what is your opinion, your thoughts on Kapil Sibal's comments earlier today?
Hello?
Yes, Mr. Sorabjee, my question was your comments on... if you can hear me, I'll try and come back to Mr. Sorabjee in just a moment. Let me come to Ravi in the studio till the time we establish a connection with Mr. Sorabjee. Ravi, you heard what Rajan had to say. Yes. He doesn't really have any beef with the courts. He can't really. That's the Supreme Court. But he put it very nicely what the telecom sector really thought of the decisions. What is your take on the whole thing and also the comments by Sibal?
Well, I totally agree with Kapil Sibal's comments. And in fact, at the risk of contempt of the Supreme Court, I would like to say that, in my opinion, the February 2, 2012 judgment of the Supreme Court was not a pragmatic one. It caused serious problems for the nation, for industry, and everyone lost. It was a lose-lose situation all around, as the minister put it, that it caused 250,000 crores worth of loss to the industry. In fact, the amount of public sector debt was about 1 lakh crores, as well as about 1 lakh senior employees lost their jobs. The consumers have lost because of the lack of competition. Companies have gone out of business. Consumers have lost. Tariffs have risen. Competition has gone down. The Exchequer has not got anything, and the industry has lost.
So you're in complete agreement with Mr. Sibal's comment?
Oh yes, totally. Totally. And I would also say that on these issues, even on legal issues, I had a lot of quibbling with what the Supreme Court said. Because if you look at para 79 of the judgment, it said, the kind of reasoning it said was, if the policies of the government are against public policy, then we reserve the right to step in.
Right, right.
Now, this is something that goes against about 60 years of collective common law all over the world, called the Wednesbury Principle, by which courts under the English common law system do not interfere in policy matters.
I take your point.
Or, on policy matters or administrative matters.
I take your point completely. I want to go back to Mr. Soli Sorabjee. I think we've passed back through to him right now. Mr. Sibal made some comments earlier during the day that the golden goose comment was not his only analogy or comment. From a legal standpoint, Mr. Sorabjee, what do you think of the minister's comment? And also, do you think judicial intervention or interference, whatever you want to call it, did actually kill a golden goose for us?
Let us be very clear about this. People should know that when the presidential reference was made, the government accepted the cancellation of the licenses. The only thing they were agreed by was the observation in the Singhvi bench judgment that it should be only by auction. So the argument was, nay, in some cases there may be, sale may be by modes other than auction. And it is well established, the court doesn't interfere in policy. That's been well laid down from Balco's judgment downwards. And even the presidential reference has reaffirmed that. But if the policy is discriminatory, or if the policy is against any constitutional mandate, then of course the court will interfere. Otherwise the court doesn't interfere because it thinks the policy is unwise or unsound or there could be a better policy. That's well laid out.
Right.
And the point of the matter is the government accepted, I repeat, accepted the cancellation of the licenses, did not file any review against that. They filed a review, withdrew it. So you're blaming the government for all the ills. And so long as the goose lays down golden eggs is fine. But what happens when the goose lays down sordid eggs?
Right.
The court has to interfere.
Right, right.
And there's a complete misconception the court is interfering in policy matters.
Absolutely.
It is reiterated twice, thrice, 100 times that we are not concerned with policy except when it is discriminatory and against the provisions of a statute.
Let's get the views of a former telecom man himself. Mr. B.K. Syngal comes back to the show. Many thanks, sir, for joining us again on The Big Picture. I want to get your views on that. You managed BSNL for a while back. You were, of course, CMD of BSNL, so you know the telecom sector inside out. What are your views on what Mr. Kapil Sibal said in the morning?
I think his views are completely misplaced for one simple reason, which is first you break it, then you can't fix it, and then you tweak a policy to create a first come first policy which has never been existent in any spectrum allocation. Broken was what? The 2003 policy clearly stated that thou shalt auction the spectrum going forward, as was done in 2001. Why was that abandoned? Nobody knows. Then the policy was tweaked in 2005 to create a sort of artificial first come first served policy which never existed in the telecom space for 20 years as we have witnessed it. And then when this monster got created, nobody knew how to fix it. Somebody has to come in. The golden goose was laid for not for the general public. The golden goose was laid for some of the players who wanted to just trade the spectrum.
I take your point, sir. I take your point. I want to go back to Rajan right now. Courts don't have the experience, ability or the wherewithal to deal with policy matters. Mr. Sibal said that in the morning as well. Do you agree?
Clearly, I think we're all in agreement on the issue that the courts don't have, if you will, the expertise to deal on policy matters, and that's well settled. I think the issue that was being raised is in the nuances and the intricacies of what is involved in the particular mandate that was handed down by the Supreme Court. In my opinion, it was very clear that the spectrum that was cancelled needed to be put up. If the DoT had gone ahead with that, all of the operators whose licenses had been cancelled would have been able to go back into the market and get the spectrum. Unfortunately, the spectrum was artificially constrained in the amount that was put up and an artificially high price placed on that, which really caused the whole issue of people leaving the market. I think that's where the problem arose.
Right. Mr. Sorabjee, do you agree the courts don't have the ability, wherewithal or the experience to deal with the economic matters? But sometimes it happens that the courts have to intervene. They don't have a choice.
No, I agree with it. The courts have themselves acknowledged that we don't have the expertise to deal with economic matters, to say this policy is better, it's more sound, another policy should not be. Courts have made it clear. But when in implementation of a certain policy there is discrimination or there is arbitrariness, then the court interferes not because it thinks the policy is good or bad, but because in implementation arbitrariness has occurred or discrimination has occurred. And in that case the court can't fold its hand and say, no, it's a policy matter, we won't interfere. Interfere and correct, I think we are all agreed in policy matters, right from bank nationalization case, they have said we don't interfere by going to the merits of the policy.
Right.
Whether it's wise or unwise or sound or unsound.
Right, very quick
Subject
reaction.
to this caveat, where there is arbitrariness.
Right, Mr. Sorabjee, very quick reaction from you, Ravi, then we go into break.
Then
Yeah,
of course
in fact, I'd like to disagree with legal luminary like Mr. Sorabjee, because if you, certainly courts right from the Wednesbury days have not interfered in policy decisions, and in fact even the Supreme Court said that in the state of Orissa versus Gopinath Dash, that we are not going to interfere in policy matters. However, if you look at the 2nd February 2012 judgment, paras 73, 74, 75 of the judgment, where the court criticized a TRAI recommendation. The TRAI had recommended on 28 August 2007 that in the 800, 900 and 1800 megahertz bands, we do not recommend an auction because it would not lead to a level playing field, because you have existing players and new players. Existing players have got it on a first come first served basis. If you go in for an auction, it will not lead to a level playing field. It will lead to more of a complication.
Would you not say, Ravi,
but then
the 2G scam was a slightly special circumstance?
Oh, absolutely. But then the Supreme Court in 73, 74, 75 said the TRAI recommendation was flawed and that the TRAI abdicated its duty because it should have. The Supreme Court said the TRAI should have recommended an auction.
Right.
In para 76, to go and say that auction should be the only way of alienating the spectrum. And actually, in para 79, they say that if the policy is against public interest, we have a right to intervene.
Right.
That is what the Pakistan Supreme Court,
we take your point. I'd like to get
Pakistan Supreme Court said to justify the military.
I'd like to get reactions on your comments as well, but we'll do that after a small break. Don't go anywhere. Lots of interesting stuff coming up on The Big Picture. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Big Picture. We're discussing Telecom Minister Kapil Sibal's speech that he gave earlier today, saying that excess of judicial intervention had perhaps resulted in a degrowth or a deceleration of growth in the telecom sector. Remember, the telecom sector a couple of years ago was known as the sunrise sector of the Indian economy. I want to go back to Mr. Soli Sorabjee for his reaction to what was said before the break. But before I do that, I want to go to Mr. Rajan first and ask him this. Rajan, between 2010, and this is according to Mr. Sibal's speech as well, 2010 and 2013, with all the experiments, instead of the 1 point something lakh crore, the government has just made 1,000 crore. Consumer tariffs have risen. They're facing the brunt of it as well. The operators are under a burden of 2.5 lakh crore rupees. This is according to the minister. Now, is blaming the courts and the decisions it took, in this case, the severe penalties on telecom companies, cancelling the 122 licenses of 9 telcos, is that the only reason we have seen this dip in the telecom space? In other words, what I'm trying to ask you, Rajan, is it correct and indeed fair to blame for the telecom sector's, halting progress entirely at the court's door?
No, I think that would be a little too simplistic to say that that is really where the woes of the telecom industry are. I think it precipitated certain activity, but clearly let me just enumerate what would be the contributory factors that got us where we are today. One is the unreasonable prices that were set for spectrum in the auction clearly precipitated further issues. The notion of this one-time spectrum charge that needed to be leveled, that certainly added another issue. The cancellation of the 3G ICR agreements, in spite of the fact of clarifications given to us, clearly attributed further negative views to the industry vis-a-vis the understanding of clarifications given to the bidding process. Clearly, the whole Vodafone issue in terms of retroactivity of application of rules and regulations vis-a-vis taxes clearly was another contributing factor. So if you go all the way down the line, there is plenty of ancillary issues that have contributed to where we are today and giving us this negative outlook.
Mr. B.K. Syngal, very quickly before I go to Mr. Sorabjee again, Kapil Sibal says that the same is true for the power and the coal sector as well, meaning that non-executive authorities, meaning courts primarily in this case, taking on interest in clearances, be it environmental or human or what have you, have made these sectors sick. Would you agree with that statement?
I don't think that we can sort it out that in that simple a way, because it's just painting everything with one white brush, a bad experience, etc., etc. The question is, the national resources have to be allocated in a transparent manner, equitable manner. Clearances should be given quickly as possible, taking everything into account, and get on with the job. That's my view. As a matter of fact, I would like to comment also on some of the comments which have been made. Even now, it's not a question of whether the courts have the wherewithal of the telecom sector or not. Even now, the judgment of the Supreme Court of February 2nd, 2012 has not been completely implemented, because there are still some licenses which should have been cancelled, have not been cancelled. It is being selectively picked up. The entire spectrum which was supposed to have been auctioned has not been auctioned. The reserve price were fixed unduly high. When we are going in for a market determined price, why should we have a reserve price so high? You see, it's completely a culmination of so many mistakes of the past which has been made since 2004, which has resulted into the demise of this sector.
Right.
Otherwise, this sector was flourishing. There was nothing wrong with the sector. It's the bad policies which were adopted from 2004 onwards,
right,
and giving a complete go-by to what were the established principles of allocation of spectrum,
right, Mr. Syngal?
flawed recommendations of TRAI, etc.
Right, Mr. Syngal. I want to go back to Soli Sorabjee for his reaction. He wanted to react before the break. Sir, here you go. Here's a chance. You wanted to say something about what was said earlier.
You know, I want to make it clear to the viewers, it's on record. The government in the presidential reference stated unequivocally that they are not challenging the cancellation of the licenses. Please read it. It's in black and white. The principal grievance was the observation in the judgment that auction is the only method. There they said it can't be, it's not the only method. It may be a desirable method, and they got a clarification from the 5-judge bench of the Supreme Court. Now we are all agreed that policy is not for the court, but what do you mean by policy? It's wisdom, it's economic viability. But when in implementation of the policy there is arbitrariness, if the government creates a mess thereby, the court has to perforce intervene.
Right.
It's not intervening on the ground that we don't approve of the policy or this other policy would be better. It's arbitrariness, discrimination. The court has to. And please remember, they filed the review against the judgment cancelling the 2G licenses, and they withdrew the review. And they accepted the judgment. So what's the other view? Creates a mess, government creates a mess. Golden goose is very well, but as I said, let it lay golden eggs.
Right.
Not dark, solid eggs.
Right, right.
And then blame the court. It's the old game. Blame the court for the mess.
It's
the old game of the executive.
Right, Mr. Sorabjee, wait for a bit. I want to come back to you for a last word. But before that, I want to come to Ravi and I want to come to Rajan. Rajan first, then Ravi.
Okay, sure.
The sector is under a 50,000 crore debt, according to the minister. What possible recourse does the sector really now have, Rajan? International players like Vodafone are not happy at all. In fact, Sibal himself signed a document today which levied a penalty of 104 crores on Vodafone. Now, what does the near future look like for what was once India's sunrise sector?
There's plenty of opportunity in the sector. I don't think it's a problem in terms of the opportunity still there. Broadband is available, data is available, you know, the opportunity for increased penetration of rural, the rolling out of e-commerce, e-governance. These are all fantastic opportunities that this nation can benefit from. So I don't think that's where the issue is. I think the issue is in terms of being able to, one, get the oxygen back into the industry vis-a-vis spectrum in adequate quantities and at a reasonable price so that the industry has the wherewithal and the building block to go forward. Secondly, make available to the industry the liquidity that it requires. Don't continue to take out the oxygen vis-a-vis additional penalties, one-time charges, and exorbitant fees for spectrum. I think that is where the industry needs to be focused on in terms of renewing the financial health of the industry and then move forward. I think the industry is well capable of taking this nation forward on that basis.
I think I have a feeling that you must agree with Rajan for a fair bit.
Well, not really, because I don't see multinational telecom operators coming in. Especially after the Vodafone case, and also because of the whole policy and regulatory and judicial uncertainty. I do not see foreign funds also coming in the near term. And the telecom operators have other countries to invest in. India is not the only country. In fact,
Africa is growing.
most of them are going, concentrating on the North American market because new spectrum auctions are coming in. There are the 4G auctions taking place all over the world. In fact, Britain has laid out the roadmap for 5G till 2020. And when they have come out with those plans, most of the large telecom operators will concentrate back in Europe and the Americas.
Right.
And money will not come to India until and unless you have a complete stable roadmap for the next 6 or 7 years at least.
Right. Mr. Syngal, do you agree with that? The future doesn't look really that bright for the sunrise sector?
No, I think the future is bright. I agree with Mr. Rajan Mathews because there is plenty of opportunity in broadband, plenty of opportunity in the rural India where 70% of population lives and agro economy is there, which is completely untapped. So the markets are there is no doubt about it, and the investors will come. I don't agree with Mr. Ravi Prasad to say that there are no opportunities. There are plenty of opportunities. The only thing is that it requires fixing. I mean, it's very easy to say that it's the golden goose which is gone, but I think it's a proverbial the naach na jane angan teda or a bad workman quarrel with his tools. That's the approach in DOT. You can't fix it. You've broken it. You can't fix it. So blame someone else. That's what's going on, and that's not right.
Right. I want to go to Mr. Sorabjee right now. We don't have much time, but sir, hear me out here. Sibal says the decision making has slowed down, and I'm quoting him right now, due to fear of courts and a senior cabinet minister like him fears signing papers. I quote again, I personally sitting on that chair fear signing something because I do not know what is going to happen in courts 5 years from now. Now, Mr. Sorabjee, this fear in decision making has happened since 2010. Apparently, our judiciary seems to have put fear into our politicians. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not convinced that's an entirely bad thing. Your thoughts?
Look, Kapil Sibal himself was a lawyer. He has argued many matters, but he's also questioned the implementation, wrong implementation of the policy. But that's apart. The question is, why do you blame the courts? You create a mess. You create occasions for arbitrary exercise of power. Suppose the policy, the courts won't interfere with the policy, but if it is implemented in a discriminatory manner, the courts have to interfere. They can't hold their hands. And Wensbury principles don't come here when there is violation of Article 14. Look, one thing I want to say, we are all agreed, I think, and I'm also saying policy matters, wisdom, correctness, economic feasibility, not for the courts. Implementation, if it's arbitrary, discriminatory, the courts have to interfere, of course, if a case is made out.
Right, sir. Very quick reaction. Very quick reaction from the other guests on what you just said. Very quick reaction on what you just said. From Mr. Syngal first. If it's arbitrary, the courts must come in. Is that what you feel as well?
I think the courts have done a good job because it was arbitrary and it was against established policy principles of 2003. The courts have done a wonderful job.
Right. Ravi, your thoughts, final thoughts on this?
I think a distinction has to be made between the criminality and the policy issues, and I think the February 2, 2012 judgment of the Supreme Court confused the two. Because the criminality was that Raja allowed certain companies to jump the queue. He passed on privileged confidential information which allowed these companies to get their bank drafts and all done in the matter of a few minutes. And he allowed companies to make windfall profits.
Right.
Now, the policy decisions, I feel the Supreme Court confused it, because if you look at the way it has criticized the recommendations of TRAI, which are taken after considerable thought, I think that was a confusion that the Supreme Court made. And in my opinion, the Supreme Court should have just cancelled the licenses of the people who jumped the queue, not set aside the entire process.
Not all of them, right?
Not all of them, only the people who jumped the queue,
Rajan,
because there were a large number of other companies which didn't jump the queue, and their licenses got cancelled.
Rajan, I have about 30 seconds for you, Rajan. Wrap this up for us. Will the goose lay a golden egg ever again?
I think the goose, if it's returned to profitability, will lay many, many golden eggs going forward. I think we have plenty of opportunity, and I think we can go ahead with the right regulatory and policy framework in place, and the liquidity and spectrum pricing at reasonableness given back to us. I think we'll flourish.
Right, so the consumers and the telecom biggies can have a golden omelette very soon then. All right, I must thank all my guests who joined me on the big picture. Soli, Sorabjee, Rajan S. Mathew, BK Syngal, as well as Ravi Prasad. That's all the time we have on the big picture tonight. Athar Khan saying goodbye, good night, and thank you for watching.